It's all been about for the last 3 weeks, ensuring that they get their disastrous, dismal Brexit tomorrow. Scotland opposed it in 2016, it opposed it last week, and we will vote against it tomorrow.
Notwithstanding the provisions of Standing Order number 57 and the practice of the House at this day's sitting may, without notice, present the European Withdrawal Bill, and that this House shall sit on Friday the 20th of December 2019. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And just to say for the record, I did negotiate to ensure that we weren't coming back after Friday. Right. I wanted the House to be in the right place, and I think that was part of my duty. We now come to presentations of Bill. Your State Stephen Bartlett. Nods. Brilliant.
European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow! I have to acquaint the House that the House has this day attended Her Majesty in the House of Peers, and that Her Majesty was pleased to make the most gracious speech from the throne to both Houses of Parliament, of which I have obtained a copy for greater accuracy. I shall direct that the terms of the speech be printed in the votes and proceedings. Copies are available in the vote office. I have the gracious pleasure that I shall, first of all, ask Tracy Crouch to move, then Eddie Hughes to second the address. Tracy Crouch.
I beg to move that a humble address be presented to Her Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that this is quite possibly the most terrifying thing I have ever done, it is of course a great honour as the re-elected and proud member for Chatham and Aylesford to move. This speech is usually a gift reserved by the whips for those thought to have had their best times. The Chief, a man well known for his elegance, charm and wit, has clearly clocked its panto season. So for asking me to do this is the equivalent of shouting, "Your career is behind you." Mr. Speaker, I think we could do a bit better than that. And frankly, it's not. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, I feel a bit more reassured if indeed the Prime Minister could perhaps join in. So, if I may, the Chief, a man well known for his elegance, charm, and wit, has clearly clocked it is panto season. For asking me to do this is the equivalent of shouting, "Your career is behind you."
Oh, no, it's not!
I said it's...
You shall go to the ball.
Instead of Cinderella or Puss in Boots, let's us raise the literary tone and note that today is the anniversary of A Christmas Carol being published in 1843. Now, Charles Dickens was a son of Chatham, and so this old has-been speech clearly makes me feel like the ghost of Christmas past. The member for Walsall North will presently play the ghost of Christmas future. And the Prime Minister is oven ready for the role of Christmas present. Now, Scrooge would have been brilliantly played by the former Chancellor, Philip Hammond. But was sadly pipped to the part by the last Speaker of this House, who auditioned powerfully for the role for many a bleak year. Old Marley sits on the front bench opposite, chained and regretful. And that's just about Arsenal's recent performance.
Smile, Jeremy, it won't kill you.
But who, Mr. Speaker, who is our tiny Tim? So valiant and small, the object of universal pity. It can be none other than the Right Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, for whom we welcome back to the House and wonder if he'll have another go at his party's leadership.
He's not here.
Now, I had thought, Mr. Speaker, of continuing the Love Actually election theme by delivering a speech on bits of card with the parliamentary choir singing carols in the background. But one, we are not allowed to bring props into the chamber. Two, I think Hugh Grant has suffered enough. And three, it would be simply impossible to fit all the names of the new Conservative intake. Now, I note that the last Kent MP to propose the Loyal Address was Bob Dunn, the long-serving member for Dartford, who started his speech by mentioning that he had been returned as a member in 4 successive general elections, and at each election the Conservative vote had been significantly higher than the time before. Well, thanks to this Prime Minister, I now know how he feels. This legislative programme outlines plans for a bill authorising the construction and operation of High Speed 2, but it was that Queen's speech of November 1994 that the legislation for High Speed 1 was tabled. Along with his constituency of Dartford, High Speed 1 travels through mine and many others in Kent. He spoke of its potential virtues, predicting the economic benefits associated with it, and he was right. Thanks to that bill 25 years ago, there are parts of Kent that have seen major regeneration thanks to a much reduced travel time into London, and there is still even more potential to unlock. Now, I'm privileged to be the member for Chatham and Aylesford, a diverse constituency with a strong naval history. A friend and mentor of mine, the member for North Thanet, mentioned to me earlier this week that he's now the only Kent MP to have been serving while the Chatham Dockyard was still operational. But then rumour has it he's also the only Kent MP to have been here when the last Thanet MP proposed the Queen's speech in 1937. Alas, the Dockyard, while not within the boundary of my constituency, has always been of critical significance to the town. It ceased operations in 1984. However, its regeneration has been remarkable, paying tribute to its heritage through housing, employment and tourism. Now, another female member of the 2010 intake to have proposed a Queen's speech is, of course, my right honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth North. Like Chatham, her constituency is built very firmly on the foundations of the Royal Navy. And, of course, she famously littered her speech with bits of the male anatomy as a dare from her colleagues in the reserves. Now, I thought I would seek her advice, given I know that I would feel sick to the core and shaken with fear, whereas she herself has shown great calmness and tranquility during tough times at the highest level. She looked at me, she took my hand and she said, "Tracy, you'll be fine, just don't cock it up." Now, I note that the last humble address to take place after a December election was proposed by Mr. Reginald Mitchell-Banks from Swindon. Hansard notes that he delivered his speech in court dress, a tradition I am grateful no longer exists.
Shame.
Although if Hansard wishes to note that I'm wearing high street chic, they are, of course, welcome. Mr. Banks spoke of the importance of trading with our friends abroad and, of course, the bonds of commerce and enterprise between the United Kingdom and those countries both near and far have only strengthened since. The famous Watling Street, a trading route used by ancient Britons, Vikings, Saxons and Romans, runs through Chatham, and it was on that road that famous battles were fought against Roman invaders. But I'm delighted to say that things have changed, and it's on that road today, now known as the A2, along with the M20 running through Aylesford, that goods come and go from the port of Dover, which, as the Foreign Secretary now knows, is a rather important trading point. It is in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, of being open to the world that 96 6 years on from that election and its subsequent humble address, we have proposed legislation that, by delivering on Brexit, creates new and exciting trading opportunities, and it starts in this House tomorrow with the withdrawal agreement. This bill will unlock and unleash Britain's potential with the rest of the world, alongside other pieces of Brexit legislation announced this morning. We stand ready to build a new relationship with our friends in the EU and elsewhere based on free trade and cooperation. And then, thanks to the legislative programme put forward today, we can raise our own standards in areas like agriculture and, of course, my own personal passions of animal welfare and the environment. The reintroduction of the Environment Bill will protect and restore our natural environment for generations to come, set ambitious, world-leading but achievable programmes to tackle pollution and enable us to make the most of our much-loved landscapes. For those of us with densely populated, polluted constituencies, with its large pockets of green space under threat from inappropriate and strategically ill-thought-through planning proposals, demonstrating that these fields not only provide a haven for wildlife, but a breathing space in urban areas that enhance health and well-being of our residents is our last remaining hope. But as well as other extremely important pieces of legislation, I know from my campaigning throughout the election, my constituents will warmly welcome plans to enshrine in law increased funding into the NHS, greater access to GP appointments, fairer funding in education, more police officers and tougher sentencing for serious criminals. They will also be delighted to hear a further commitment to supporting those with poor mental health. Members of this House, including myself, have spoken powerfully and personally about their own brushes with various mental health conditions. It is right that we help remove the stigma around mental health by talking about it, but it is action, not words, that matter. And so it's paramount that we ensure that our constituents, whose voice may not be as loud as our own, receive the treatment that they need by guaranteeing that we treat mental health with the same urgency as physical health. I was proud that our manifesto included commitments to improve the overall well-being of the nation. And while there may not be in the legislative programme outlined today, measures such as investing in grassroots sport, enhancing physical education in schools and reform of the out-of-date gambling legislation, the Prime Minister should know that there is wide cross-party support for such improvements to begin their laborious Whitehall process, and I hope they will do so soon. Mr. Speaker, I made my maiden speech during a debate on poverty. Part of my constituency suffers enormously from deprivation, and I work alongside many organisations to support those who find themselves unable to cope. Charles Dickens chronicled vividly the poverty of Victoria Britain, inequalities which were alleviated in the ensuing 180 years by moderate, enlightened governments of all colours. Mercy and altruism must remain our mission in today's One Nation Conservative Party. I've worked with many MPs from other parties in this House on various issues. And of course, I welcome and congratulate my new colleagues on these benches, but there are friends opposite who I will miss enormously. And although we've not covered ourselves in glory for these past few years, new MPs will soon discover that this place is at its best when we work together and relationships and friendships will be formed over issues that need cross-party consensus if they are to progress. Chatham's hero, Dickens, may have been a great social reformer, but he also observed that there is nothing in this world so irresistible as laughter and good humour. Perhaps it would be no bad guide for us as we repair this House of Commons in the coming months. Let laughter and good humour replace recent rancour. Let friendships thrive through adversity. And let us respect our differences, but not let them divide us. And of course, let Tottenham finish above Arsenal in the league.
That's a given.
So as I finish my humble offering to Her Majesty, may I take this opportunity to wish colleagues and all the hard-working House staff a very Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah and a peaceful holiday season. And in the words of Tiny Tim at the end of A Christmas Carol, God bless us, everyone.
I call the member for Walsall North, Eddie Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, I hope you will forgive me if I look slightly bewildered being called to address a full House of Commons chamber. I've simply never had this experience previously. In fact, Over the previous 2.5 years, I've got used to being called at the end of a debate to address a House of Commons chamber that's almost completely empty, and then being given 2 minutes to make a 10-minute speech. So, Mr. Speaker, if you like what you hear over the next few minutes, I would like to think you will call me early in debates, unlike your much-loved predecessor. But for the moment, Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to relish this amazing opportunity to talk to all of these people. And it is an incredible privilege to be seconding the gracious speech, but it's also an incredible privilege to follow on from my dear and good friend, the Honourable Member for Chatham and Aylesford. Now, if I remember correctly, she won her seat in 2010 from a Labour member. Now, if my maths is right, we've got 50 new Conservative MPs in this chamber that have won their seats from Labour members as well, and from right across the country, from Innismon to Ipswich, Oh, you had to ruin the flow, didn't you? Come on, guys. You're meant to be nice. To me, I meant. Anyway, back to it. From Innismon to Ipswich, from Kensington to Blythe Valley. And I think anybody who's got a political bone in their body should just take a minute to remember how they felt when that Blythe Valley result came in. Now, Mr. Speaker, I won my own seat in 2017. But it was from a Labour member, but it was 1976 when the Conservatives last won that seat, and they only managed to win it at that time because John Stonehouse, the Labour MP, faked his own death. While on a business trip to Miami, he left a pile of clothes on the beach, pretending that he'd gone for a swim, never to be seen again, supposedly. Well, I tell you what, he was a damn fine swimmer. Because 5 weeks later, he turned up 10,000 miles away in Melbourne, Australia. Now, he was arrested and he tried to apply to a couple of countries for asylum, but that didn't happen, so he was deported back to the United Kingdom, and incredibly, while out on bail, he continued to serve as a Labour MP. Now, I'm not sure, but I don't think the Right Honourable Member for Witham, the Home Secretary, would allow such leniency these days. But I did find it amusing when I read a line on Wikipedia that said the Labour Party were unhappy with this situation but chose not to expel him. That sounds like a familiar theme these days, I think. Anyway, for those of us who are 2017 MPs, this has felt like a very precarious innings, like we're never more than 5 weeks away from a general election. So I was getting a bit concerned because my predecessor in terms of Conservative MPs, who is now Baron Hodgson of Abbots Astley, I think, hopefully Hansard will correct that if I got it wrong, he managed to serve 910 days as the MP for Walsall North. Now, when Parliament was dissolved on the 5th of November, I'd served 881 days. I know, thank you for playing your part. So I knew I had to win that election. I had to beat the Baron. But anyway, the good omen for me and for this incredible Conservative victory should have been apparent to me on the 27th of April this year, because with just a few days to go before the local elections, I was visited by a man who was, at that time, the humble backbencher, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip. He wasn't the Prime Minister then. Anyway, to the House, the blonde bombshell was unleashed on the unsuspecting people of Bloxwich, and the result was truly magnificent to behold. Everybody who asked for a selfie was greeted with a beaming smile and an occasional tussle of those famous blonde locks. And when our tour reached its inevitable destination, the Bloxwich Showman, the future Prime Minister obviously pulled a pint of Thatcher's Gold. Now, I know what you're thinking, Mr. Speaker. You're thinking, So what? What was the consequence of this great visit? Well, the consequence for me was that in those local elections a few days later, we won 2 more council wards against the national trend, and for the first time ever, the Conservatives took control. First time in 20 years, the Conservatives took control of Walsall Council outright. Now, that shouldn't have been a surprise, maybe, because over the past 3 years, we've had a blue-collar revolution. The working people, the working class of Britain have sent 2 shock results to Westminster. And who led both of those campaigns? One man who completely understands that actually what the public want, what ordinary working people want, is a government that will stay out of their way, but will ensure they have safe streets, a good standard of education for their children, and a great national health service when they need it. We now have a government and a Prime Minister that understands that and will deliver. People lent us their vote in this election. We cannot let them down. We must not let them down. We will not let them down. But Mr. Speaker, I think you know the answer to this question. What is the first priority for this country? Oh, you're supposed to say get Brexit done. Anyway, get Brexit done. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, in an interview immediately after the election result, I think I heard the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington, the Shadow Chancellor, say that he now understood that the public wanted to get Brexit done, but the Labour hadn't been listening. Now, in my constituency of Walsall North, 74% of people who voted in that referendum voted to leave. But that wasn't the interesting thing for me during the general election. When I was telephone canvassing, I spoke to lifelong Lib Dem voters who had voted Remain in the referendum, but were now voting Conservative because they said they were real Democrats. They knew how important it was for this country to deliver on the result of that referendum. But Mr. Speaker, Walsall North is like many of the constituencies we've just won. It's among the most deprived constituencies in the country. But now we have a Prime Minister who completely understands that although ability is equally distributed across the country, opportunity is not. And that's why we're going to transform further education system by investing in a huge new rebuild programme worth £1.8 billion. But investment in infrastructure is also incredibly important. There are towns like mine, Willenhall, where the manufacturing base has been decreased over recent years. So I was delighted to work with the Mayor of the West Midlands and secure the money for a new train station for Willenhall, because that train station will be a lifeline for that town. It will allow the people of Willenhall to travel to Birmingham or to Wolverhampton more easily for job opportunities or for education opportunities. But it will also allow people to travel in to Willenhall. So if we can continue to remediate those old industrial sites, we automatically free up new opportunities. And I'm imagining a time where we've got a robotic factory in Willenhall making goods that would otherwise be brought over from the other side of the world, therefore also reducing our carbon footprint. But, Mr. Speaker, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what about the I'm going to look on the camera to see who said that. That's not what you were thinking, Mr. Speaker. I know you. You were thinking, what about the NHS? Is it safe in this Conservative government's hands? Mr. Speaker, let me tell you, it certainly is in Walsall North, because thanks to the Health Secretary, I've got £36 million for a new A&E department, which is going to increase capacity as well as improving conditions for staff and patients alike. What about the rest of the country, though? I don't know where to begin. 50,000 extra nurses. Thank you. 50 million extra GP practice appointments per year and 40 new hospitals. But what about the future of our great nation, Mr. Speaker? Well, I'm delighted to read that this Conservative government, by the end of this Parliament, will be investing a stonking £3.2 billion a year in research and development. Although I completely agree with the honourable member for Harborough, who said we simply cannot continue to have half of that money spent in just 3 cities, London, Oxford and Cambridge. We need to spread that throughout the country. So, Mr. Speaker, from my personal point of view, it certainly looks like the country's future, the future of the whole United Kingdom, is incredibly bright with this Conservative government. And so as we look to 2020 with a newfound spirit of optimism and ambition, it is my privilege, on behalf of the great people of the Black Country, to commend this gracious speech to the House.
The question is that the humble address be presented to Her Majesty as follows. More gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's more dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. I now call the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's the tradition at the beginning of each session of Parliament to commemorate former members of the House who have died. And it's only been 2 months since the last state opening, but in that time, sadly, we've lost our great friend Frank Dobson, former MP for Holborn and St Pancras. Frank was a very, very committed Health Secretary from 97 to 99, who began the rebuilding of our National Health Service after being so disgracefully run down by the Conservative government at that time. He was always an incredibly friendly face, always full of anecdotes and jokes that I can't repeat here, and he'll be greatly missed by all of us on this side of the House, and I suspect many others who knew him as a thoroughly decent Member of Parliament who was very committed to his constituents and to the cause of good housing across the country. We've also lost David Lambie at the magnificent age of 94. David was the Labour MP from 1970 to 1992, and I knew him very well as a very committed peace campaigner. On Tuesday, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and I both remembered Saskia Jones and Jack Merritt, the wonderful young friends who died in the appalling terror attack in the Fishmongers' Hall. And it's right that, again, we pay tribute to them today for the way in which they lost their lives and the message they left behind. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all new members to the House on both sides of the House, because being a Member of Parliament is a massive achievement, it's a massive honour, and I would have thought in witnessing our opening proceedings today, many must think, what on earth have I taken on? Is the pantomime season has come very early this year. But I think that, yeah, look behind you. If I may continue, Mr. Speaker, and I would also like to pay tribute to those members who lost their seats in the general election, because to serve in Parliament and fight an election and then not be returned is an amazingly traumatic experience when they put such huge amount of work in to the campaign and the work that they've done. And the trauma they must all feel is something that I think everyone in this House should just think on for a moment, on the human side of what it is like to go through that experience. So I pay tribute to them and thank them all. I won't mention all the names, but one I want to particularly draw, well, if I could just commemorate and thank the amazing work and presence that Dennis Skinner has been in this Parliament through all the years that he was an MP. And, Mr. Speaker, I would like to congratulate the proposer of the loyal address. The member for Chatham and Aylesford showed passion and integrity. And that's what she became known for since her very principled resignation from the government over its failure to restrict fixed odds betting terminals. And I thank her for that. But I'm afraid that, Mr. Speaker, is where we part ways. For is anything that can drive a wedge between two people, even more than a Brexit vote in this place, it's the North London rivalry between Spurs and Arsenal. These things may seem trivial, but some, as the great Bill Shankly once said, put it this way: some people say football is a matter of life and death. I'm very disappointed in that attitude. It is much more important than that. And to put it another way, it'll help the honourable member, Arsenal won 13 league titles, Tottenham 2. But we take our victories where we can find them. But I do want also to compliment her, particularly on the last part of her speech dealing with the natural world and the environment. I think it was incredibly important and very well put. And can I also congratulate today's seconder of the Loyal Address, the member for Walsall North, for his speech and the spirit with which he gave that speech. I got a sense of the spirit of Walsall when I was in Walsall College recently. Wonderful place and wonderful students. Members opposite are renowned for their membership of various clubs. The Bullingdon Club, the Reform Club, and so on. There's many of those clubs. But I was absolutely overjoyed in researching the member to find that he is a member of one of the greatest and most prestigious clubs of them all. The honourable gentleman is a trustee of the Walsall Wood Allotment Charity, which is a fantastic honour. I'm sure everyone would agree. And he will understand more than most the ecstatic pleasure that we allotment holders, also the PROSA, get from our allotments and the produce we get from them. So I hope this will provide an opportunity for a genuine bipartisan working relationship over the onions and the carrots. Mr. Speaker, it's just 2 months ago that the Prime Minister made the Queen come here in the rain as part of a pre-election stunt. Since then, he has made many promises to many different parts of the country. He has promised to address problems that are a result of his own party's actions in government and their political choice to impose austerity cuts on this country. There can no longer be any doubt that austerity has caused unnecessary suffering to millions of people all across this country. The communities to whom the Prime Minister made his promise will now judge him on whether he keeps them. In this Queen's speech, the government has tried to mimic some of the priorities and, interestingly, much of the language of Labour policies, but without the substance. On austerity, on investment, on regional inequality, on the National Health Service, we can see how we forced the terrain to shift. They say, Mr. Speaker, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, even if it's very pale imitation. But I fear that those who were swayed by the Prime Minister's promises will be sorely disappointed. As this Queen's speech shows, what the government is actually proposing is woefully inadequate for the scale of the problems that this country faces. Our NHS, the country's most precious institution, is on its knees due to this Tory government. The government now talks about enshrining the funding settlement in law. Enough of the gimmicks, just fund it properly. I don't remember the last Labour government having to pass a law to force itself to invest in the NHS. Yet it increased NHS funding by a rate of 6% per year. This government is proposing little more than half that, less in fact than the historical average. The gap between the government's rhetoric on the NHS and the reality is enormous. Last week, for the first time ever, every single major accident and emergency unit in England failed to hit its 4-hour waiting time target. Every major unit failed to meet the target. Every single one under this government. The number of people in England waiting for operations is the highest since records began, 4.4 million. And the number of unfilled staff vacancies has ballooned. The Prime Minister's promise of 50,000 extra nurses was quickly revealed as a sham. 19,000 of them already work for the NHS. And his promise of 40 new hospitals turned out to be a reconfiguration of just 6. Mr. Speaker, the public will remember this. They will not look kindly on promises that are not kept. This government says it will take action on hospital car parking fees, following our lead. But where we propose to abolish them, only apparently some people will be entitled to free parking under their plans. It was the disastrous Health and Social Care Act, brought in by the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats when they were in coalition, which flung open the door to privatisation, which is the cause of so many problems in our NHS. Yet the Queen's speech says nothing whatsoever about the Health and Social Care Act and the privatisation that it's brought. Not so long ago, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street and announced he had a plan to solve the social care crisis. So where is it? It wasn't in his party's manifesto, and all we have today are empty words about bringing forward proposals. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. All we had in the last Queen's speech were empty words about bringing forward proposals. And in the Queen's speech before that, what do we get from the Conservatives? Empty words about bringing forward proposals. At least they've got continuity on this. Cuts to adult social care are expected to reach almost £8 billion by the end of 2019-20. But the government is only putting £1 billion back in. It's like taking £8 from someone and expecting them to be grateful when you give them back £1. So when it comes to young people, Mr. Speaker, the government seems to have just given up altogether. This is yet another Queen's speech that's miserably weak on education, nothing for early years, nothing for colleges, nothing for universities. The government clearly has not heard the anxious cry of parents and teachers about school funding, overcrowded and unqualified teachers. The funding promised for schools will still leave them hundreds of millions of pounds worse off in real terms than they were in 2010. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Brexit, the election result demonstrated a strong determination from many people across our country to end the mess and paralysis of the last 3 years. We understand that people are desperate to move on. That does not mean we will just accept the Prime Minister's reckless approach on how it's done. He has now deliberately resurrected the threat of no deal at the end of next year, which would decimate industry and destroy people's jobs. That threat is now written into the withdrawal agreement bill. The Prime Minister has shown time and time again his priority is a toxic deal with Donald Trump that will sell out our NHS, risk the safety of our food, our environmental protections and workplace rights. We do not want our NHS given over to US corporations. And we don't want expensive medicines with extended patents. And we don't want food like chlorinated chicken on our dinner tables either. We know that the Prime Minister's deal won't put Brexit to bed. It will just be the beginning of years of more drawn-out negotiations. Mr. Speaker, it's been reported that the government wants to scrap the Department for International Development, a proud achievement of Labour in government. Will the Prime Minister confirm that this government will not close DFID? And will he ensure that 0.7% of the UK spending continues to be used to help end global poverty and destitution? I note the commitment to develop a sanctions regime to directly address human rights abuses. That sounds like good news for Saudi Arabia. Should the Saudi regime be worried, or will the government continue to ignore their human rights abuses and their war crimes in the Yemen that have resulted in famine and humanitarian disaster? According to the UNHCR, the Refugee Commission, there are almost 71 million forcibly displaced people around the world. Where is the government's commitment to do anything for those desperate people fleeing war, violence and famine? Around the world, Mr. Speaker, Britain should stand up for human rights and democratic rights, including the right of workers facing exploitation and abuse. So it's very worrying that here at home, the Conservative government is planning an assault on workers' rights to withdraw their labour, beginning with the transport workers. No worker, Mr. Speaker, goes on strike lightly, but we will oppose any attempt to curtail that right. We've already seen some of the most draconian anti-worker laws, and now the government seeks to take us even further back in time, again in breach of the conventions of the International Labour Organization. In a country where pay is too low, work too insecure, and bad employers too common, attacking the rights of the working people to stand up for themselves is a completely wrong-headed approach. And on the subject of transport, with planned transport investment in the north, less than half that in London, what assurances can the Prime Minister give that the commitments on investment in the Queen's speech are not just another failed gimmick like the Northern Powerhouse was? We should take it, Mr. Speaker, as a form of flattery that on investment, the words of the Queen's speech echo what Labour has long argued, that investment is desperately needed in every part of our country. But the scale of investment planned by the government falls woefully short of what is required. Speaking of falling woefully short, this Queen's speech contains nothing of substance to deal with the colossal challenge of climate and environmental emergency. Net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is the government's target, is too late, and in any case, at the current rate of progress, we won't reach net zero until 2099. Any target date will be fanciful if action doesn't start now. What are the Prime Minister's plans on climate for this year and for each year after that? It's clear that COP25 this year was a failure. Next year, Britain has the honour of hosting COP26. And frankly, I think it would be embarrassing for all of us to host such a vital conference if we are not doing enough to reduce our own carbon emissions and show we've made some real progress towards bringing forward the target date. The government needs to get serious and put young people's futures before those of the big polluters, many of whom fund the party opposite. Mr. Speaker, this Christmas, thousands of people will be sleeping rough on the streets, thanks to this government and its housing policy. Rough sleeping has doubled under the watch of the Conservative Party in government. Everyone who sees people huddled in doorways in the cold, in the fifth richest country on earth, knows it is morally wrong. Shelter says that 280,000 people will be homeless on Christmas Day in England alone, either rough sleeping or living in temporary housing or hostels. So can the Prime Minister explain why there is no mention of homelessness in the Queen's speech and why there is so little to address the housing crisis? Could it be because he doesn't want to upset the billionaire landlords who back his party? The Prime Minister has used Labour's idea of offering discounted homes to first-time buyers. It's OK, it's more flattery, but let's see the substance of it. What reassurance can he provide that this won't go the same way as the failed Starter Homes programme? Remember when we were promised 200,000 starter homes in 2015, but as yet we've seen absolutely zero. The fire at Grenfell Tower exposed a housing system that is fundamentally broken. Yet 2 years later, 319 of the 446 buildings covered in aluminium composite cladding have not had it removed. Imagine living in one of those buildings and feeling at risk. Probably not something many members of this House go through, but an experience that thousands of people go through every day, living with the fear of a burning inferno in which is their home. So will the Prime Minister now set a hard deadline for all landlords to replace dangerous cladding? And will he fund the installation of sprinklers in high-rise social housing blocks and reverse budget cuts to the fire service. Mr. Speaker, we will look at the findings of the Government's Royal Commission on the criminal justice process. But I simply say this: any changes in sentencing must be done in consultation with anti-terror experts and not as a knee-jerk reaction to make political capital. Mr. Speaker, this Queen's speech is notable for what's not in it. Does nothing for students who are being lumbered with huge debts, does nothing for older people unable to pay their heating bills this winter, does nothing to address the levels of poverty in our country. And this year, the United Nations, yes, the United Nations itself, had to take our government to task over the shocking fact that 14 million people are living in poverty in this, the fifth richest country in the world. Shouldn't that be a source of shame to this government? Shouldn't their Queen's speech contain something to address this? Why is there not even a mention of universal credit, the cruel policy that has ruined so many lives? Why is there no commitment to immediately raise the minimum wage to £10 an hour so that people can no longer have to work their fingers to the bone and still remain in poverty? These things aren't in the Queen's speech because this government, that Conservative Party, does not stand for the people at the receiving end of their policies. Despite all their promises, that is exactly what this Queen's speech shows. Mr. Speaker, the central aim of my party, the Labour Party, is to stand up for working people, for every part of this country, for the many, not the few, to deliver social justice, prosperity and a society that works for all. As this government ploughs ahead with its programme of gimmicks and false promises, we will be holding them to account every step of the way and campaigning inside and outside Parliament and across this country for the real change that this government sadly will not deliver, but that our country so desperately needs.
I now call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the moment to repay the trust of those who sent us here by delivering on the people's priorities with the most radical Queen's speech for a generation. And if there was one resounding lesson of this election campaign, one message I heard in every corner of these islands, it's not just that the British people want their government to get Brexit done, though they do. They want to move politics on and move the country on. Building hospitals, renewing our schools, modernising our infrastructure, making our streets safer, our environment cleaner, our union stronger. And this Queen's speech of this people's government sets in motion a vast interlocking programme to unite and level up across the whole United Kingdom and unleash the potential of all our people. This one-nation government will enshrine in law record funding for our NHS, take back control of our borders with a wholly new immigration system, toughen our criminal justice system with longer sentences for the most dangerous offenders, double investment in basic science research, and protect our environment with a bill so ambitious and so vast that there is no environmentally friendly way of printing it off. And, Mr. Speaker, this is not a programme for 1 year or one Parliament. It is a blueprint for the future of Britain. Just imagine where this country could be in 10 years' time. Trade deals across the world, creating jobs across the UK. 40 new hospitals, great schools in every community, and the biggest transformation of our infrastructure since the Victorian age. British scientists using new gene therapies to cure the incurable, the hitherto incurable, and leading the dawn of a new age of electric vehicles, not just cars, but planes, pioneering solutions to the challenge of climate change. And I do not think it vainglorious or implausible to say that a new golden age for this United Kingdom is now within reach. And in spite of the scoffing, in spite of the negativity, in spite of the scepticism that you will hear from the other side, we will work flat out to deliver it. Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty's gracious speech was expertly proposed by a beacon of our one nation conservatism, my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesford, who is not only a football coach of great distinction, who has done much to champion the female game, which will be a key part of this country's bid for the 2030 World Cup. But she is so personally skilled at the game, with what has been described by her adversaries as a take no prisoners style, that according to the Daily Telegraph, and if you can't believe the Daily Telegraph, Mr. Speaker, what can you believe? She was once barred from playing against men to protect their egos, and has even used this dispatch box for an impromptu game of kicking up. He uses this dispatch box as a goal mouth, Mr. Speaker, in what was probably one of the less shocking innovations tolerated by the previous Speaker. My honourable friend has also done pioneering work on tackling loneliness, improving dementia care, and curbing the harms, as we've heard, inflicted by gambling and alcohol, and is so dedicated to her job that she's regularly brought her son Freddie into the lobbies, so reducing the voting age to about 6 months. And Chatham's great parliamentary sketch writer, Charles Dickens himself, would confirm that her speech was in the very finest traditions of this House. She was followed with great style by my honourable friend, the member for Walsall North, when he addressed this House for the first time in 2017. He said, and I quote, "The good people of Walsall North have had to wait 41 years to hear a maiden speech from their MP. You can imagine how disappointed they will be." Well, my honourable friend was being characteristically modest, but I cannot help noticing how the good people of Walsall North have taken drastic steps to avoid another maiden speech. They not only re-elected my honourable friend, but they've quintupled his majority just to be sure. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member, gentleman, right honourable member of this pointed out, you wait years for a Queen's speech, and then along come two in short order, something my honourable friend will appreciate as one of the growing number of bus drivers' children on Conservative benches. He was elected as a. I know you want to ask about. I know the honourable gentleman wants to ask about buses, but I must make friends. He was elected as a blue-collar Conservative from a traditionally Labour seat, a path that many have just followed. And since then, as he pointed out quite rightly, he has secured funding for a new A&E department at his local hospital, a new railway station for Willenhall. I know he comes from a Labour family. In fact, I think his brother is a Labour councillor. And when he first declared himself a Conservative, he felt, he said, like the black sheep of the family. All I can say is I bet if they're watching today, they will feel nothing but pride in my brilliant speech. Mr. Speaker, let me also welcome to his place. Let me welcome to his place, right honourable gentleman, the leader of the opposition, a stickler, as we all know, for watching a Queen's speech at the right time. Though I don't know what he has against coronation chicken, Mr. Speaker. As our exchanges across these dispatch boxes come towards a close, alas, let me say that our personal relations have always been excellent, and as for all our disagreements, I have never doubted that the right honourable gentleman's beliefs are deeply held, and his sincerity is to be admired. Certain members of his shadow cabinet, on the other hand, are absolutely clear where the responsibility of the election result lies. The voters of the country have let their side down, let his side down. They have forfeited the confidence of the opposition, and the time has come for Labour to take the only possible step: dissolve the electorate and replace it with a new one. At least I think that's what the lady for Islington and Finsbury said. For my own part, Mr. Speaker, I feel a colossal sense of obligation to the electorate that I and we are humbled to serve, and to those people who lent us their votes, however hesitantly. This government will now engage flat out flat out on a programme of change for the better. Tomorrow is the day when we finally peel back the plastic wrapping about which you have heard so much, Mr. Speaker, and present our oven-ready deal, and it will go into the microwave as the withdrawal agreement. It works in both devices, this deal. Taking back control of our money, our borders, our laws, our trade, clearing the way for an overarching programme of national renewal. And above all, it is time to invest in that institution that gives the country its cohesion and even our national spirit. The simple and beautiful idea that whoever you are, the NHS is there for you when you fall sick. And as our NHS cares for us, so we will care for the NHS, delivering the biggest cash boost in a generation, and for the first time this Queen's speech guarantees a new funding settlement in law. And what will that pay for, Mr. Speaker? I hear you ask, the biggest hospital building programme in living memory, with 40 new hospitals, 50,000 more nurses and their bursaries, 6,000 more GPs, 50 million more GP appointments, and we will introduce an NHS visa, a new NHS visa, to fast-track talented staff from overseas. We will scrap those iniquitous hospital parking charges for all staff and vulnerable people, and we will guarantee dignity and fairness for everyone in their later years with a long-term and sustainable solution to social care. And indeed, I invite cross-party work on that solution in the spirit of cooperation that I think is supported by many, many members on both sides of this House. And, Mr. Speaker, while many of these measures were indeed foreshadowed in the last Queen's speech, fortified by our new mandate, we will go even further. We will give millions of tenants greater rights over their rented homes, abolishing no-fault evictions. We will help millions of commuters whose lives are made miserable by strike action, by imposing minimum service agreements. On that, I'm happy to give way. If he's opposed to helping struggling commuters, and I'm delighted to hear from him. Go on.
Earlier on, he used the slogan People's Parliament, but the people of Scotland rejected his government. And if he really believes in the people, isn't it right the people of Scotland should have their say in a referendum?
Mr. Speaker, I think it was Nicola Sturgeon herself who said that the referendum in 2014 was a once-in-a-generation event. I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but I feel that the Scottish Nationalist Party should concentrate more on delivering on the domestic priorities of the people of Scotland and rather less on breaking up our United Kingdom. We will abolish. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that if I gave way to the honourable gentleman, I would be forced to repeat the point I've just made. We will abolish the threat of no-fault evictions, and we will take forward our plans to rejuvenate and in some cases, in many cases, Mr. Speaker, to revolutionise the infrastructure of Britain, including Northern Powerhouse Rail. We will remedy the scandal that Leeds is the largest city in Western Europe without a light rail or a metro. We are dramatically improving local bus services, levelling up across the country to the standards set in London, at least as they were set under the previous mayor. And we are investing nearly £30 billion in our road network, including upgrading the A66 to the first continuous dual carriageway across the Pennines since the 1970s. And above all, this one nation government will strengthen our United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the most successful union in history, and a sacred inheritance that this Parliament will never allow anyone to rip up or rend asunder. And we will stand by one of the greatest international symbols of British courage and daring, our armed forces, the men and women who sacrifice so much to safeguard our way of life. We will protect our protectors from unfair and vexatious legal claims which undermine their morale and confidence. And we will spare no effort in addressing the profound concerns of millions about the state of our criminal justice system, with the first Royal Commission for almost 30 years. And action now to impose tougher sentences on the most serious offenders. And if the honourable lady opposite actually wants to contest the need for tougher sentences for serious offenders, I'm happy to hear her view.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. I'd like to ask him, in the Queen's speech there was mention of a sentencing bill. Will this include provision for increasing the sentence for death by dangerous driving from 14 years to life imprisonment? And if it won't, is the government open to accepting an amendment?
The honourable lady makes an important and valid point, and I have no doubt that she reflects the concerns of her constituents, and we will certainly be looking at what we can do to make sure that people who are guilty of dangerous driving do receive the penalties that they deserve. And I know that the Home Secretary will listen very carefully to what she has said. We will end the dangerous practice of early release of terrorists, but our reforms will only stand the test of time if our system of government here at Westminster meets the challenge of a new era. The steady erosion of faith in politics has poisoned our public life, and so we will establish a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission to recommend proposals to restore trust in our institutions and our democracy. And, as a first step, we will repeal the Fixed Term Parliament Act, so that never again can we have the ludicrous spectacle of an opposition party trying to defy the will of a majority of the House and run away from a general election. And we will do everything in our powers. We will do everything in our powers to restore devolved government in Stormont so that Northern Ireland is once again ruled by its own elected representatives. And when it comes to standing by our friends, on the Northern Ireland, of course.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and of course we all look forward to devolved government being re-established in Northern Ireland fairly and equitably for all. Will the Prime Minister make good on his commitment for a golden age of all of the United Kingdom by ensuring that he makes good on the promises made for bus building in Northern Ireland and for infrastructure in Northern Ireland, so as we can all enjoy the golden age of infrastructure and build the Boris Bridge, not just the Boris bus?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I think he can certainly be assured of my commitment to ensuring that beautiful buses continue to be built in Ballymena. And I will do everything we can to make sure that that continues to be the case. As for his desire for a bridge to connect the two biggest isles in the British Isles, all I can say it is a very interesting idea. I advise him to watch this space and indeed watch that space between those islands, because what he has said has not fallen on deaf ears, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to standing by our friends, whether in Northern Ireland or elsewhere, one innovation that this Queen's speech introduces, Mr. Speaker, is that we will stop public bodies from taking it upon themselves to boycott goods from other countries to develop their own pseudo-foreign policy against countries which, with nauseating frequency, turns out to be Israel. Mr. Speaker, the scale of our programme is matched only by the sense of responsibility that falls upon us now, upon all of us now who have been elected. And again, I congratulate all new members, but a huge responsibility falls upon all of us now to redeem and to repay the trust of the British people. And I say to the people of this country, we owe you. We know it, and we will deliver. And we have now the energy, we have the ideas, we have the mandate, we have the people, and we will spare no effort to fulfil that mandate. And as we engage full tilt now in this mission of change, I am filled with invincible confidence in the ability of this nation, our United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to renew itself in this generation as we have done so many times in the past. And after the dither, after the delay, after the deadlock, after the paralysis and the platitudes, the time has come for change and the time has come for action. And it is action that the British people will get from this gracious speech, this most gracious speech, and I commend it to the House.
Mr. Speaker, and I hope before...
Message to Scotland, One nation Tories. One nation Tories.
Together, just out there.
Can people now leave quietly for those who are leaving? We will try again. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was absolutely nothing in that address from the Prime Minister for the people of Scotland. And I hope for people that were watching and listening back home that it was led by the announcement, this is not for viewers and listeners in Scotland. Mr. Speaker, let me congratulate the member for Chatham and Aylesford and for Walter North for their addresses this afternoon. And, you know, when I was listening to all the stories about Christmas Carol, of course, we didn't hear from what member of the Conservative front bench would be playing Scrooge. And I must say to the honourable member for Walsall North, I know he's a great football fan. I thought he would perhaps mention Aston Villa. I know they're not having the best of times, but I hope he's enjoying watching John McGinn that we gifted from Hibernian to him last year. Mr. Speaker, this morning Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has written to the Prime Minister to demand the transfer of legal powers to the Scottish Government to hold a second independence referendum under Section 30 of the Scotland Act. Mr. Speaker, as the First Minister outlined, there has been a material change of circumstances since the independence referendum of 2014, based on the prospect of Scotland leaving the European Union against its will. And it is for the Prime Minister to explain to the people of Scotland why he is denying Scotland the right to choose our own future. Why did democracy stop in the Prime Minister's world with the independence referendum in 2014? And can I say to the Prime Minister, it is not a good look to see him playing with his phone rather than listening to the legitimate demands of the Scottish National Party. Of course, you know, the Prime Minister says say something more interesting. Well, Prime Minister, this is about democracy. This is about the Scottish National Party that stood in the election on a manifesto about Scotland's right to choose. And it was about the Conservatives that said no to Indy Ref 2. And, Mr. Speaker, what happened? Well, the Conservatives lost more than half their members of Parliament. Prime Minister, you got your answer from the people of Scotland. The SNP got 45% of the vote, a 20% difference to the government. We got 80% of the members of Parliament that sit on these benches. Someday, the Prime Minister is going to have to respect democracy. The Prime Minister can't and will not continue to say no.
Grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. The Prime Minister says that looking at his phone is more interesting than hearing what Scotland needs. Doesn't that tell you everything? Doesn't that tell you everything about this Prime Minister and his view of Scotland?
Indeed it does. Mr. Speaker, well, you know, there isn't really much that can be added to that, because the image of the Prime Minister playing with his phone, not listening to the Scottish National Party, says it all. Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland did not vote for this Prime Minister. Scotland did not vote for this Conservative government. And we certainly did not vote for this con of a Tory plan set out today. Mr. Speaker, in December 1967, my old friend Winnie Ewing proclaimed that the march of time can bring anomalies between elections, so that sometimes a government may have a majority in this House but be in a minority in the country. Mr. Speaker, in Scotland that is certainly the case. Here in this place we face a Tory government that we have rejected, implementing a manifesto that Scotland rejected. Mr. Speaker, for too many years Scotland has been held back by successive Tory governments that we didn't vote for. Mr. Speaker, SNP MPs have today set out an alternative Queen's Speech to deliver for the people of Scotland with a renewed and strengthened mandate. Our expanded SNP team will focus on our priorities, on Scotland's priorities, on stopping Brexit and protecting Scotland's NHS from any grubby Trump trade deal, on dealing with the climate emergency and once and for all putting to an end Tory austerity. The government's Queen's Speech instead sets out another Tory government that the people of Scotland rejected. Despite the fact that Scotland voted to remain a member of the EU, we now face being dragged out against our will. We often hear about losers' consent, but the fact of the matter here is that Scotland voted to stay in the European Union to maintain our rights as EU citizens. This Conservative government does not have the consent of the people of Scotland, does not have the consent of the Scottish Parliament or our government to take Scotland out of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, we ask that the solemn right claimed by the people of Scotland to determine the form of government best suited to our needs must be exercised. This claim of right was accepted as a principle in this House on a motion moved by myself in July 2018. Mr. Speaker, it is the Scottish people who are sovereign. In this context, it is right for the House to respect our Scottish Parliament and to respect the election result from last week. But of course, in the last Parliament, the Tories ignored our interests and sidelined the will of the Scottish Government, intent on bringing forward a deal that will destroy our economy, risk jobs and livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, as the former EU Permanent Representative to the EU, Sir Ivan Rogers, said, this pledge will create the biggest crisis of Brexit to date in late 2020. Get Brexit done is diplomatic amateurism dressed up domestically as boldness and decisiveness. From setting off our NHS to setting out Scotland's fishing communities. The Prime Minister will inflict hardship on our communities at the cost of delivering his damaging Brexit. And with the people of Scotland silenced, their voices silenced, the 80% of the seats in this House not listened to by a Tory government showing contempt. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we stand up for Scotland. That we stand up against these cruel, punishing policies and narrow, backward-gazing politics. And instead, Mr. Speaker, that we are determined that Scotland's right to choose our own future will be delivered. Not simply because we in the SNP want it, but because the people of Scotland are demanding it. We stood on a mandate to give Scotland the right to choose its own future, and I want to put the Prime Minister on notice. The SNP members on these benches will not ever stop fighting this government for that case, for our mandate to be respected, a mandate for a fresh independence referendum. Now, I see the honourable gentleman seeking to intervene. Will he accept democracy? Will he accept the right of Scotland to choose?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Will he accept democracy? Will he accept that last week 55% of Scots voted for parties that want to remain in the United Kingdom? There is no mandate for a second independence referendum in Scotland. The Scottish people are not calling out for a second independence referendum. They want us to get on with the day job. Fix your own backyard first before you come in here demanding that the Scottish...
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend says, what absolute tosh. You know, you cannot get away from the fact that we won the election. We sit here standing up as a voice for Scotland, and he lost most of his colleagues that were rejected at the ballot box. They've been reduced to a rump. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that we have got 80% of the seats on our side. The government could only wish that it had such a mandate, such a majority in the rest of the EU. The reality is, no Democrat can deny this. We won the election. We demand the right to have our referendum. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament has a strong record for bettering the lives of citizens across Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, we know with more powers, with independence, we can and we will do so much more. Today, the SNP has published our alternative Queen's Speech. The people of Scotland voted to lock Boris Johnson out of Downing Street and escape Brexit. Scotland voted to choose a better future. Our plan is to deliver that better future. We want to see a National Health Service Protection Bill to stop the NHS across the UK being at risk from a US trade deal. This will guarantee that trade deals will not undermine the founding principle of the NHS that we cherish so much. We will continue to make the case and work to ensure that Scotland's voice is heard and our nation has the right to choose its future. We will deliver in Scotland a bill to increase parental leave with an additional 12 weeks to be ring-fenced for the father in order to encourage take-up as well as to increase statutory maternity and paternity pay. The SNP New Green Deal will build on the transition towards a greener, sustainable future. And we will continue to press the UK Government to match Scotland's net zero emissions target by 2045 and putting oil and gas receipts into a net zero fund focused on measures to battle climate change, putting tackling the climate emergency front and centre of our priorities. That, Mr. Speaker, is what a responsible government does. And of course, unlike the Conservatives, our ambition is to end poverty, not increase it by a failure to act, a failure to show leadership. Poverty is not inevitable, and to fight it, we will work to end the disgraceful two-child cap on tax credits and associated rate clause. We call on the United Kingdom Government immediately to end the benefits freeze and to halt the rollout of universal credit. And, Mr. Speaker, we will use every device open to us in this place to make the case that we cannot allow our citizens to be dragged into debt, hardship and despair by this nasty, careless Tory government. We want to bring forward an equal living wage bill, meaning that living wage increases to at least the level of the real living wage and an end to age discrimination. Scottish National Party MPs reject the wholly immoral replacement of nuclear weapons at a cost of over £200 billion. And we call on other parties to follow us, to say no to Trident, to remove these weapons of mass destruction from the Clyde. And, Mr. Speaker, we want to help our pensioners by ensuring the BBC licence fee remains free for those aged over 75. And just like we have done in previous parliaments, we will not abandon those women born in the 1950s by exposing and demanding that this government delivers justice for the 3.8 million women born in the 1950s, denied their pension by this Conservative UK government. We will be pressing for an NHS funding boost from the UK government that matches the current Scottish level, and for constitutional change and abolishing the House of Lords, extending the franchise to include 16- and 17-year-olds. Mr. Speaker, this expanded SNP group is determined, and we are ready for the challenge. This government thinks it can do what it wants to with Scotland and get away with it. It will not happen on our watch. The Tories are risking our economy and reducing opportunities for citizens. Mr. Speaker, the choice is clear. An outward-looking country with a vision of tolerance, inclusiveness and prosperity for all, in contrast to this offering of a union run by a Tory party who don't care about Scotland. The Tory programme for government that will push child poverty to a 60-year high and devastate our economy. The hardest of Tory Brexits that risks up to 100,000 jobs being lost in Scotland. The Tory manifesto means that in 2023-24, day-to-day spending on public services outside health would still be almost 15% lower in real terms than it was in the start of the 2010s. Austerity has hit the communities hard, and it's not going away. It is more of the same from the Tories. And despite the climate emergency, there is nothing in this Queen's speech to make real progress on reducing emissions. The UK Government has already failed to match the Scottish Government's net zero emission target of 2045. And, Mr Speaker, that's just the start of it. And yes, the Conservatives can say England and Wales had its say. But what about Scotland? We had our say, and Scotland rejected this Prime Minister. Scotland rejected the Tories. For those of us who represent the people and the will of Scotland, we will use every avenue open to protecting our people against this government and its shoddy plan for government. Mr Speaker, before I close, I want to appeal to members across the House. In the last Parliament, members conducted themselves in less than acceptable ways on occasions. And people across these islands have recognised it, and they are fed up with it. So let us start this Parliament with respect and let the strength of our arguments win the case rather than dragging this place into the gutter. Finally, Mr Speaker, in setting out the SNP's clear opposition to the Government's Queen's speech and offering our alternative, I have set out to the people of Scotland the tale of two governments, of two parties, of two futures. I started with the words of Winnie Ewing, and I want to begin closing with the words of another parliamentarian. Let me remind the House of the words of Charles Stewart Parnell. No man has the right to fix the boundary to a march of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, thus far shalt thou go and no further. Now Scotland must have the chance to choose its own future, one shackled to the Brexit destruction imposed by Westminster, or one with hope, with opportunity and ambition, an independent Scotland in the European Union.
Former Prime Minister Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and may I first of all take this opportunity of congratulating you on your election as Speaker. I know that you will reside in that chair and uphold the best traditions of the Speaker of the House of Commons. But I also want to thank you for the work that you have done, and I know you will continue to do, in showing a concern for the health and well-being, including the mental health, of members of this House and staff across Parliament. Thank you for all that you have done. Mr Speaker, I've been in this House for over 22 years, and this is the largest number of Conservative members of Parliament I have seen in this House. And I would like to congratulate my right honourable friend for leading our party to an overwhelming victory. One thing now is certain. The lobby is going to be rather crowded. But may I just personally say it's going to be a rather welcome change to see all Conservative MPs going through the same lobby. I hope my right honourable friend will also forgive me if I just reflect that this was the result that was supposed to happen in 2017. But of course, back then, people still thought the Labour Party was supporting Brexit. 2 years on, they saw that was a sham, a pretence, and a betrayal of millions of traditional Labour voters. And those Labour voters have now elected Conservative members of Parliament. This victory brings with it a huge responsibility, because they have put their trust in us, and as my right honourable friend has said, we must work flat out to repay that trust. Not just government ministers, but every single one of us on these benches. And of course that means delivering Brexit. It means delivering on the manifesto commitments on schools, on the NHS, on infrastructure, which is why the legislation and commitments in the Queen's speech are so important. But it means more than that. It means truly building a country that works for everyone. And that has always been the ambition of the Conservative Party, because we are a party that is at our strongest when we appeal across the board to people regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, background, income, where they live. That is the true Conservative Party. And so we must deliver on Brexit and those manifesto commitments, but we must go further. We must ensure that every decision we take in this House, we remember those communities who have lent us their vote. That means things like taking forward the modern industrial strategy, ensuring prosperity across the whole country, and I welcome the commitments in the Queen's speech on science and spending on science and on research and development. It also means remembering those communities when we're negotiating trade deals around the world, including with the European Union. Because good trade deals will be ones that protect the jobs of those who have put their faith in us. But more than that, bring good, new, better jobs here to the UK. And isn't it interesting to note, we haven't actually, so far, I think, in this debate, had a reference to the fact that it is yet again under a Conservative government that we have seen employment go up. Good trade deals, good trade deals also protect the rights of workers and those who have put their trust in us. And I welcome the commitment to an employment bill in the Queen's speech, which I trust is going to not only enshrine but enhance workers' rights in this country. And good trade deals also ensure that we maintain the high standards we have in this country in areas like the environment. And the Environment Bill is going to be a very important piece of legislation as it's set out in this Queen's speech. So we do need to deliver on all of these issues for people, and particularly for the communities who've lent us their vote. Because these are the communities who felt most left behind by globalisation. These are the communities who all too often have borne the brunt when rights and standards are not protected. So we have got a very real job to do in terms of delivering for those people who have put their trust in us. And of course, we need, as we do this, as we deliver Brexit and look ahead to the end of next year, we have to deliver that trade deal with the European Union by the end of December 2020. There are those who say it cannot be done. I do not believe that. I have every confidence that it can be done. But we must do more than that, because by the end of December 2020, we have to have agreed and ratified, such that it will come into operation on the 1st of January 2021, a new treaty on security with the European Union. Again, I have every confidence it can be done, because a significant amount of work has already been put into these issues, and the elements of that are there, agreed with the EU in the political declaration. So there's work to be done, but it can be done, and it must be done to that timetable. Another issue, of course, which people across the UK will look to us to deliver on, are the social injustices that still persist. I welcome very much in the Queen's speech the reference to the domestic abuse bill. And I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for the speed with which he responded to me when I pressed him on this matter earlier this week. Instantly, indeed it was. That bill, which has cross-party support, is genuinely going to improve the lives of victims and survivors of domestic abuse. I also welcome the reference to reform of the Mental Health Act, although, yet again, I'm bound to say that I would have preferred a more full-blooded commitment to a new Mental Health Act. The review of the current Mental Health Act that we had raised so many issues about how we deal with and how we treat people with mental health problems. It's not just about resources. It's about the attitude and way in which people are treated. And if we put those changes into place in a new Mental Health Act, we will genuinely be bringing significant improvements to people in this country with mental health problems. But there are other social injustices we need to look at too. One of the things that underpins social injustice often is a feeling among the powerful that there are others in our society who they can treat as second-class citizens. I think one of the worst examples of this, or it brought it really home, was the way in which the girls who were being sexually abused and young boys being sexually abused and groomed in Rotherham were treated by the authorities in that place. It was as if these were people who did not count, but they did count. And we must always remember that every member of our society, every resident of the UK counts. It is that sense of ensuring equality that lay behind the work that was done on social housing. And I note the commitment the government has made to bringing forward a social housing white paper. I think it is very important that we continue with that work to ensure that the voice of those in social housing is heard. And then another injustice we need to address was highlighted by the race disparity audit. The race disparity audit was groundbreaking work by a Conservative government. It shone a light on injustice that too many experience and too few are willing to acknowledge. And it is important, we can't address all of the issues that were raised, all of the findings immediately. But we do need to ensure, and I want to ensure, that the government does not abandon the work on the race disparity audit. Because if we do take action across the board, then we will truly be creating one nation. Now, speaking of one nation, my right honourable friend has on a number of occasions expressed his desire to unite the country. Of course, that won't happen if the United Kingdom is torn asunder by those who want to ignore the ties of family, of history, of shared endeavour, of shared endeavour over the years. My own view is very simple. I think that breaking up the United Kingdom is to the benefit of no one and the detriment of all. And I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for the reference in the Queen's speech to the integrity, the importance the government attaches to the integrity of the United Kingdom. And I look forward to the work that I know the government will be doing to ensure that that is demonstrated. I will give way once.
I thank the former Prime Minister for giving way, and she spent a lot of her speech speaking about the debt that her party and her successor owes to those who lent her party their support. But of course, she will know better than anyone that it is a true leader and a true statesman that acknowledges those who did not vote for them and that work for them. So I turn to the result in Scotland, where the SNP secured 45% of the vote. Nobody denies this Prime Minister's right to govern on 43% of the vote. So how can she turn round to the people of Scotland and say we cannot have our say on our own future after the general election that we just had in Scotland?
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman that, as he will have heard from my excellent honourable friend, the member for West Aberdeenshire and Kilmarnock, 55% of people in Scotland voted for parties that support the union of the United Kingdom. And it's all very well, I heard the right honourable gentleman, the member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, and he made this great plea at the end about how an independent Scotland was going to be in the European Union. We all know an independent Scotland will not be in the European Union. We're not allowed to be in the European Union. So what the Scottish nationalists are saying to people in Scotland is simply not true. I want to raise, Mr. Speaker, I want to raise one final issue, which is referred to in the Queen's speech, in the reference that is made to the UK's place and influence in the world. And I note that there is going to be a full review of international policy, building, I have no doubt, on a number of reviews that have taken place in recent years and work that has been done. But it is very important that we look at this issue at the moment. Of course, global Britain has never gone away. We always have been a global Britain. We have, over recent years, continued to play an important role in international fora on issues such as climate change. We've played a key role in dealing with terrorism, with modern slavery, with people smuggling. We've enhanced our presence in key areas, east of Suez and the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, we brought together action across the world when we found that a chemical weapon had been used on the streets of the UK by Russia. But at the same time, we have seen internationally the international fora and also the rules-based international order on which we have depended for decades coming under significant threat. At the same time as we have seen the atmosphere and discourse of politics in the UK become more acrimonious. So across the world, we've seen a change too. And what we've seen is an emphasis on absolutism and confrontation rather than compromise. And we have a decision to take as to where we sit in that, whether we side with the absolutists or whether we actually continue to be a country that believes it is right that the countries will come together internationally, restrain their own demands in order to seek agreement for the greater good of all. And we've also seen some interest from some in stepping back from a defence of democracy, human rights and the rule of law. We have to decide whether to look inward or whether to continue to play a role in defending those values. I believe we should, because that is what global Britain is all about. And it is important that we continue to uphold those values around the world. Now, of course, this may bring into the spotlight our relationship with the United States of America. That is a special relationship that we must nurture and preserve. It is in the interest not only for us and the United States, but also for the world that that special relationship is maintained. But it's not a one-way relationship. We don't just accept every position the US takes. We consider our own interests. And when we believe and we disagree with them, then we tell them clearly that we disagree with them. But I think, as we have seen over the last 3 years, this House focusing so much on Brexit and focusing so much internally, now we have the opportunity. We can set that to one side and we can move on to being the global Britain that my right honourable friend has spoken about and that every Conservative member on these benches espouses. A Britain that is taking its place in the world. A Britain that is recognising the need to reform the international rules-based order, playing a role, not just a role in that, but actually playing the leading role in that reform. And a United Kingdom that stands up for the values that we share, the values of democracy, rule of law, human rights. A United Kingdom standing proud in the world. I believe the world needs the United Kingdom to take that role. And I know that under my right honourable friend, we will do just that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the chair of this House. It's a pleasure, too, to follow the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Maidenhead, because despite our political disagreements, I think she and I agree on what she said about everybody counting and government being there for everybody. And I want to thank the people of Hackney South and Shoreditch who have re-elected me for the 5th time to stand up for all of them, not just the 73% of them who voted for me, but for the others who didn't as well. And I will stop at nothing, Mr. Speaker, to stand up for them in this House. Mr. Speaker, this Queen's speech is quite incredible. It talks about investment in education, the NHS and public services. But this by a government that has slashed spending over the last 9.5 years. The promise of more funding for schools comes now, but only after 9 years of funding cuts that have led to an 8% per pupil funding decrease over the last decade. And this is the government that talks about more police. But who was it, Mr. Speaker, who cut them in the first place? And the Prime Minister has been very keen to talk about the past as though it was a different country. And I simply, if he were in his place, would ask him and remind him that he has not just been the Prime Minister for a few hundred days, but he has been an MP, the Mayor of London. He cannot dodge responsibility. But I will, of course, welcome things in this Queen's speech when it will deliver for the people of my constituency. And while it is a bit bitter to hear the government talking about investment in broadband from the same government which rigged the last broadband competition for rural broadband particularly so that only one bidder could win, it is actually important that we do invest in this infrastructure in our country. And even in my constituency, even in Shoreditch, where we have the heart of the best tech businesses beating like a heartbeat for Britain, we have too poor a broadband service. So I will join with the government in supporting investment in broadband if they will deliver in my constituency and across the country. But I can't stand today, Mr. Speaker, without highlighting the real challenges of the people of Hackney South and Shoreditch. As the former Prime Minister said, everybody counts. In my constituency, that includes half of our children who live in poverty after housing costs are taken into account. In my constituency, or across Hackney, 30% of deaths are still premature, and the leading cause of that is cancer. So investment in our health service for early diagnosis and treatment is absolutely vital. And above average, 1/5 of adults smoke still in my constituency, compared to around 14% of the London population. And Hackney has the highest rate of diagnosed depression of any London borough, at nearly 1 in 10. So I welcome a review of mental health support, but like the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, I think we may need to be more radical than that, so I'll be watching that closely. And Hackney as a borough is the 11th most deprived of the 326 English local authorities. So while some people talk about us being achingly cool, they think of the hipsters with their beards, they think of our bread makers, our beer makers, and so on. A very high percentage of my constituents are in great need, with over a third living in financial poverty, earning 60% of median earnings after housing costs are taken into account. And I wanted to see this Queen's speech say a lot more about housing. In my borough, you have to have 17 times your salary is what would take it to buy a home. That compares with the London average of 13.8%, which is pretty high, and the England and Wales average, which is also high at 8 times the amount. But it means that home ownership is out of the reach of very, very many. And in my constituency, there are more private renters than there are homeowners. Half of all households are represented in social housing, which is more than the other two combined. But in a real stain on one of the richest companies in Europe and in the world, over 3,000 families are living in temporary accommodation. And just in the last few weeks, a man wrote to me begging for help because he has for 2.5 years lived with his 8-year-old son in one room in a hostel. And we have a fantastic Labour-elected mayor in Hackney who is doing his utmost to resolve this housing crisis, which is costly to the individuals concerned, costly to our communities, and costly to the taxpayer. But without more from this government, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to deliver for those 3,000 families who need help. Those children who will be living without a permanent roof over their heads and celebrating Christmas in one room, in a hostel, or in short-term, inadequate temporary accommodation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wouldn't want to suggest that this poverty is also a poverty of ambition. Because, boy, do my constituents want to get on in life. But without those basic building blocks of primarily secure, long-term, affordable housing, swift and easy access to proper health care, and secure, properly paid jobs, and access to skills development, they will never get there. Some in my constituency earn enough money to work a 4-day week. Many, many more work 3 or 4 jobs on poverty wages, on 0-hours contracts, just to make the rent. And there are invidious policies like the bedroom tax, which doesn't work. On one estate, the Wenlock Barn estate in Hoxton, 74 families are hit by this, and they don't have an option to move to a different property. It's a cloud cuckoo policy, and one if the Prime Minister is anywhere honest about his desire to be a one-nation Conservative, he would abolish right now. But all governments, Mr. Speaker, should be creating a ladder of opportunity for the people of this country. This government, or the governments before it, have ripped away the lower rungs of that ladder, so it is a very long reach for too many of my constituents. And I want to see some commitment that they will help my constituents. Moving on to some of the specifics of the Queen's speech, Mr. Speaker. Her Majesty talked about the government continuing to lead the way in tackling climate change. It has been my great sorrow, in one of my responsibilities as the former chair of the Public Accounts Committee, a role I hope to resume in this Parliament, that I have crawled over the detail of the government's policy on climate change. So what do we see? Carbon capture and storage, 3 expensive competitions, wasting millions of pounds, achieving absolutely nothing. The much vaunted Green Deal, with the noble aim of greening our homes. Let's face it, more domestic emissions come from our housing than from aviation. But it was scrapped as a total failure, predictably, and it cost the taxpayer the equivalent of £17,000 per loan granted. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to her for giving way. She's making a powerful speech. She will know that yesterday the Committee on Climate Change wrote to the Prime Minister to say that action on climate is falling short. Does she agree that that will continue to be the case for as long as this government does not commit to leaving fossil fuels in the ground? That means ending mass road building, ending mass aviation expansion, and also ending the mass subsidies to the fossil fuel industry.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point, and I'm sure she'll be making it more firmly. But I think one of the things that I think is really concerning is we have to look at this in the long term. And let's be clear, governments of different colours were not dealing with this early enough and properly enough. But we now need to tackle it. And a government with a majority of 80 has every opportunity to be bold and ambitious in this direction. But it scrapped the Green Investment Bank. Well, it privatised the Green Investment Bank. It became the Green Investment Group, and it doesn't need to even deliver on any of its green principles. It's not very few guarantees about where that money will go. That would have been a huge opportunity had it remained in public hands to invest in emerging green industries, creating those jobs and opportunities as well as tackling climate change issues. And that was another opportunity squandered. And you compare this to what Labour in power can do. I just turn to my own borough, the Labour-run borough of Hackney, which has set very bold targets that it is achieving on tackling climate change. Already, half of the electricity for the council and local schools is generated from renewable sources. And by April of next year, that will rise to 100%. And only very recently, the council established a publicly owned clean energy company, which will maximise all council-owned roof space to generate renewable electricity. It's decarbonising its vehicles, it's tackling so many other issues. I haven't got time to go into everything today, but it is setting the example of what can be done. If one London borough can do this, what could a government do if it set its mind to it? And the government really needs to step up. And I invite whichever relevant government minister, of course we wait reshuffles, to come and see what my borough is doing, and we can show you how we lead the way. The Queen's speech also touched on swift justice for knife possession. And this is a scourge of our young people in particular. There are too many people in my borough who are fearful of walking their own streets because of the impact of knife crime. And only during this election, another young man's life was lost and another family is bereaved. And I'm angry, Mr. Speaker, and disturbed for the families that I have to visit, I choose to visit, who have lost loved ones, whose lives have been devastated as a result of knife crime. However, I urge the government to tread carefully. Yes, knife crime is a scourge, but if we simply say that we will criminalise more the people who carry knives, what happens is people choose to carry other sharp weapons. So we will need to look closely at the detail of this bill to make sure it achieves what it sets out to, and not just a headline. And the Humble Address also talked about new rules for councils, police, schools and housing associations to work together. Well, the Mayor of London, of course, let's remind ourselves, a Labour Mayor of London, set up the Violence Reduction Unit to do just that. And in Hackney, we have the Integrated Gangs Unit. So once again, and I genuinely and openly offer the government the opportunity to come and see what we're doing locally in Hackney. We haven't got all the answers, but we are tackling this. And unfortunately, from bitter experience of what the impact is on our community. It rather surprised me, Mr. Speaker, to hear Her Majesty talk about setting up a Royal Commission on Justice. I don't think this is really necessary. I could refer the government to a slew of Public Accounts Committee's reports and concerns raised on probation, where we have seen a failure of the modernisation of the probation system and an attempt to reverse those changes. Prisons, where we've seen a slashing of prison officer numbers and huge issues there. Chaos in courts and tribunals, and a huge IT project that is behind schedule. The problem is, several Secretaries of State and Justice were throwing everything in the air, wanting to change everything overnight, and that is a recipe for chaos. What we need is to go back to the basics, to stability, not to have stop-start, not to have reversal, and make sure there is proper investment in our criminal justice system. A Royal Commission worries me. It kicks the can down the road, as there is a danger that we'll never actually deliver. A Royal Commission can take a couple of years, and government has to consider it. We haven't got that time to wait. Actually, it's much more simple than that, and I hope the government will look at those bits of our work and make sure that it takes those points on board. I was interested in the National Skills Fund, Mr Deputy Speaker. I hope, maybe I hope too hopefully, that this might mean investment for people in low-paid work who want to improve their skills, something the Labour manifesto proposed. If it will end the need of that barrier for skills training and further education, that barrier of a loan, which for many of my constituents, who are women returning to work, who've been in low-paid jobs, had children, and they do not want to take the risk of a loan in order to possibly get a better paid job. They can't afford that. They haven't got the credit record for that, and they're very nervous about that. If the National Skills Fund supports them, fantastic. If the National Skills Fund also makes sure that our young people are training in the tech skills that are global skills that many of my tech businesses in Shoreditch find hard to get in the UK, then great. And as I said from the very beginning, if there is something that the government is doing that will help my constituents, I will work with them on that. But I wait to see the detail. On immigration, I am sadly an expert in the failings of the Home Office in this area, as one of the top 6 customers of the 650 members of this House to the Home Office, representing constituents' concerns. I also represent the world in one borough. People from across the world come to my surgery telling me their problems with immigration. And we have 40,000 European citizens in Hackney, as well as the many Commonwealth citizens. And the hostile environment is in reality in my borough. When leave to remain was reduced from 5 years to 3 years, guess what? That meant 2 fees that constituents had to pay before they could apply for their citizenship. And then in a very mean-spirited way, it was reduced to 2 years. So you have to pay 3 times the fees before you can qualify for citizenship. And many of my constituents really struggle with those costs. I, of course, want a fair system, a clear system, and a faster system. But we shouldn't be putting up barriers to people who have demonstrably shown that they have a legitimate right to be here and are simply being pushed through a bureaucratic process that delays their eventual proper opportunity to fulfil work and family hopes and contribute to our communities and our economy. The government has talked about investment and borrowing in this Queen's speech in a very simple phrase, and I look forward to seeing the detail. Her Majesty talked about the government keeping borrowing and debt under control and a responsible fiscal strategy. Let me assure the government that if I am returned to the position as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, or indeed even if I'm not, I will hope that that committee watches every penny and pound of taxpayers' money that is being spent. And I will be challenging the government on the efficiency, the effectiveness and the economy of every promise made in this Queen's speech and every plan that emerges from it. But above all, Mr Deputy Speaker, I will challenge, cajole, criticise and at every stage make sure this government is doing what it can to deliver for the best interests of my constituents in Hackney South and Shoreditch.
Sir John Redmond.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it was a pleasure at the start of this debate to see our new Speaker in the chair.